There we go. So good morning and thank you to everyone for joining us. My name is Mike Talbot. I am Notre Dame International's Director for Initiatives in Mexico. Today is our second Mexico virtual lecture of this academic year, and it's presented by Notre Dame's Mexico Global Center here in Mexico City, as well as additional support from the Center for Social Concerns. These lectures are intended to highlight the work of our faculty in Mexico and with Mexican partners, as well as deepen our community across the two countries. So thank you all for joining us today. Before we begin, all the normal prefatory remarks and requests, please keep your microphones muted. This is simply intended to prevent background noises from interrupting the presentation and conversation. And then secondly, please feel free to submit questions at any point. You can do so in the chat, you can raise your hand, you can type in, I have a question. I'll keep track of those and moderate those, and the presenters will address them at the end. So now briefly, just to introduce our presenters, Elena Magione Lora is a teaching professor of Spanish language and culture in Notre Dame's Department of Romance, Languages, and Literatures. She's taught there for 23 years. She focuses on making classes a meaningful experience for students and incorporates community-engaged learning, translation, and interpretation skills, constant evaluation, and feedback for improvement. All of this is to the end of consolidating the grammar, vocabulary, and concepts that the students have learned in previous courses, and to prepare them for opportunities that await them outside the classroom, namely immersion experiences, service and community-engaged learning, and continued study in upper-level literature and culture courses. In addition, Elena researches and presents on alternative assessment techniques. Her interests include the intersection between technology and language pedagogy and the art of translation, as well as community engagement and the incorporation of social justice issues into language and culture studies. At the risk of jinxing it, I should mention also that we anticipate, we hope that she will be here in Mexico in Puebla teaching next semester, although in these uncertain times, you never want to jinx anything, I suppose. So we're very excited to have Professor Magione Lora with us today, as well as one of her former students, Alec Helmke, who I should note is also an alumnus of the Notre Dame Study Abroad program in Puebla. I'll ask Elena to introduce Alec during her remarks, so that I can stop delaying any further and simply hand over the word to her. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you. Well, you all are in for a treat with Alec and some of these cool ideas that come from the work, a team. And so I'm going to start with thank yous. First, I'd like to thank NDI, especially Mike Talbot, for the invitation, and Lisette Monterroso for her vision and indefatigable work with promoting good relationships between Notre Dame and Mexico through our study abroad program. I want to thank the CSC, especially Rachel Parroquin, the Spanish CBL coordinator, who has been an invaluable support and resource, the Department of Romance Languages for recognizing and supporting the importance of experiential and community engaged learning, ILS, who's sponsored many of our courses for its inclusive and integrated appreciation for US and Latino and Hispanic culture. Our community partners for being co-educators of our students, including Holy Cross Grade School, and Claire Roach for her contagious passion and generous heart. En el Hogar del Sagrado Corazón de Jesús in Paine, Chile, and Padre David for opening their hearts and home to us to pray and learn with their community. Two more, UPAEP, for their willingness to partner with us to create a faculty exchange program that will allow for even deeper mutual understanding and appreciation between our institutions and home cultures. And finally, to Alec Helmke, a 2019 Notre Dame grad and current pharmacy student at the University of Michigan, for his generosity in being here today to show firsthand the power and beauty and continued impact of what our students can do with the experiences that they have here at Notre Dame. So we're talking about building good neighbors through experiential learning locally and abroad. Building good neighbors starts with the willingness to be a good neighbor, but good intentions alone can get us into trouble. I'm thinking of a charming friend some decades back who welcomed a new Muslim neighbor to the block with fresh baked cheesy sausage bread and a bottle of wine, neither of which he was able to taste. Or my parents' friends who once brought over a bouquet of mums. Their thoughtfulness was overshadowed by the Italian funerary connotation of the blooms. When we equip our desire to be neighborly with intercultural competence, we have a better chance of understanding and being understood. Intercultural competence is the ability to effectively function across cultures. To do this, one must be able to recognize, think, communicate, and act appropriately with people from different cultural backgrounds, at home or abroad. As a teaching professor of Spanish, I am happy to tell you that culture and intercultural competence have been long recognized as integral components of new language learning. Culture is one of the 5 C's in the US national standards, and intercultural competence is not only a fundamental learning outcome in most foreign language or most new language programs, but it is also a booming industry, growing rapidly since the mid-1990s especially. Foreign language programs are uniquely positioned to offer opportunities for authentic contact with other cultures through authentic materials, experiences, and personal relationships. Their superpower, in my mind, however, is that they offer opportunities to inquire, explore, and reflect on practices, values, and beliefs in other cultures. And in doing so, they offer a mirror that allows us deeper scrutiny and understanding of our own. Indeed, self-awareness is the absolute foundation on which intercultural competence is constructed. That said, in our basic language courses, more intensely in our language and translation courses, we do the difficult and uncomfortable work of unlearning. It's what I call check my bias, or preparing the earth. This comes from the New Testament parable in Matthew, in which a farmer goes out to sow grain. Some of the seed falls on the path or on rocky soil where it is eaten by birds, or where it sprouts, and having no place to take root, it dries up and dies. The great lesson for educators and industry alike, particularly with regard to diversity and inclusion efforts, is that one must prepare the earth, removing rocks, aerating soil, planning to give the proper follow-up, if we want blooms from what we sow. As I said, this work is uncomfortable, but I have found that the key to this work, at least for me, is to remain non-judgmental so that students don't close themselves off defensively. They remain open to learning and growing. I can share with this audience, however, that I find it embarrassing and shameful that the Council on Foreign Relations reports that fewer than 1 in 4 Americans has a favorable image of Mexico. Misconceptions abound regarding its economy, its government, its cultural and linguistic richness, its complex history, and its relationship to its neighbors to both the North and South. In encouraging one of my own students this past week about studying in Puebla, her response was, "Well, I feel like I already know Mexico because there's a big Hispanic population in my town and a lot of Mexican restaurants." To those who are rolling their eyes right now, I can only evoke the Anglican Bishop Desmond Tutu's proverb, "The elephant can only be eaten 1 bite at a time." Until they go abroad, then it's a veritable feast. Indeed, Mark Twain tells us travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be required by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime. The Council of Foreign Languages confirms Twain's wisdom with the following finding. What did emerge is that Americans that know Mexico, having visited for work or fun, feel better about the country. time to encourage visits on top of the estimated 22 million trips by US citizens each year. Perhaps that can change perceptions. Encouraging students to study and travel abroad is the ultimate goal. But we start that encouragement in the classroom. To spark conversations, sometimes I use actual questions that students have asked me in class over the years. Again, please join me in being non-judgmental. These students are ones who have chosen to learn more about Mexico and Mexican culture. And yet with their limited exposure and experience, they have asked some of the following questions. Are all Mexican people mestizo? Do all Mexicans want to come to the US? Do Mexican people eat things other than burritos and tacos? And do they drink things other than beer, margaritas, and soda? Are most Mexicans farmers and maquiladora workers? Are Mexican people always late? Is La Virgen de Guadalupe the patron saint of Mexico? Is she the Virgin Mary? Is Mexico a Catholic country? These questions are a real gift because they are an invitation to being taught and openness to learning. I'm going to switch gears for a moment and talk about the look inward that complements that look outward expressed in the students' questions. In learning about other cultures, students unlearn things about themselves too in the process. I like to call this the, you mean that's not universal moment. And they often begin with a fun example from my year as an English teacher in Japan in the mid-90s. When we point to ourselves to clarify, who, me? What do we typically do? Most US Americans point to their chest or their chin and accompany the gesture with a widening of eyes and an inquisitive look. Who, me? The Japanese may or may not use facial expressions depending on the context, but they do not point to their chin or chest. They place the point of their index finger to the tip of their nose. While this is an example from another culture, it invites students to be open to and to question what other gestures or reactions they might take for granted as being universal rather than idiosyncratic. And I'm going to, let's see, move, there we go. Move us along to the cultural iceberg. From here, we explore levels and nuances of culture in general, using Edward T. Hall's cultural iceberg model, first proposed in 1976. It is as relevant today as ever. And you can read sort of the difference between surface culture and deep culture. You can see from the model that many of the culture questions our students ask fall into surface culture. Food, drink, dance, music, dress. Notions of time, space, courtesy, friendship, and leadership, dynamics in families and work groups, people's relationships to the land, in short, how people interact and make decisions, can be hidden in the depths of our own lack of awareness that these values, thoughts, and subsequent actions are not universal, but rather learned as part of our conditioning and participation in the spaces and groups around us. Students have expressed this as learning cultural empathy, putting oneself in another's cultural life. And they find it fascinating to know that even if I hold the dignity of each person to be a guiding value in my thoughts and actions, how I choose to recognize the dignity of others can actually diminish their dignity in their own cultural context. I find it tricky to give examples out of context and without the nuance we hope to achieve over the course of a semester. But I will offer, again without nuance, the idea that US Americans value what you see is what you get, unadorned sincerity, and I'm just being honest with you, directness, that runs counter to the art of well-crafted, flowery, and what US Americans perceive as indirect expression that is so favored by many Mexicans, especially in formal or official settings. Meaning and intention can get lost by reactions to what is perceived as rude bluntness or a frustration with unnecessary formality and decoding. My just telling you as it is can embarrass you irreparably in certain social or professional situations. The example most accessible and fascinating to students is the difference in the way Mexicans and US Americans experience time. For US Americans, time is linear, time is money, and like money, time is measured, marked, and exchanged in uniform units, minutes, hours, days. Time allocated for meetings, therefore, is transactional, in exchange for a predetermined objective. For Mexicans, like for Italians incidentally, work is money, time is life, and any transaction can only take place on a foundation of established relationships in a context of mutual trust, which take time and intentional interaction. This is why US Americans can get antsy during long dinners or other activities that seem to have little to do with the tasks at hand, not realizing that those activities are indeed the tasks at hand. I've given two brief examples, but in both examples, one can see that beyond being sensitive to and aware of these cultural differences, we try to arm ourselves with practical strategies and checks and balances, usually by depending on relationships with trusted friends in those cultures. Paul himself suggests, that the only way to learn the internal culture of others, that is to say, the implicitly learned, unconscious knowledge, is to actively participate in that culture. The culture blog from which the iceberg graphic is taken, The Celestial Peach, puts it nicely, quote, "When one first enters a new culture, only the most overt behaviors are apparent. As one spends more time in that new culture, the underlying beliefs, values, and thought patterns that dictate that behavior will be uncovered." That is, understanding the iceberg from the bottom up helps us to have a better sense of apparent differences. We start with values and thought patterns, which lead to beliefs, and those are manifested as behaviors. Paul suggests that the only way to learn the internal culture of others is to actively participate in their culture. Enter experiential learning. Now, learning through experiencing another culture through immersion is offered through NDI's wonderful study abroad programs at UPAYEP and the Tec de Monterrey in Puebla, for Mexico specifically. But students on Notre Dame's campus in South Bend are incredibly fortunate. They can actively participate in the cultures of our community partners, La Casa de Amistad, El Campito, Holy Cross Elementary School, and the Sister Maura Brannick Clinic. These are just a few partners with which our Spanish program co-educates. Before I continue, I'm going to be bold enough to take Hall's and other scholars' work and add our own Notre Dame contribution to the field, building a fourth space. This idea came out of an animated student discussion about our work with immigrant communities in South Bend. The questions the class started with were, what does it mean to belong to a community? And does a host community have any responsibility to an immigrant community? Here is some context. National and transnational identities are often talked about as distinct spaces, so that one's home country can be referred to as the first space, the new country, a second space. And as any immigrant knows, there exists a third space, ni de aquí, ni de allá, as the beautiful Facundo Cabral song goes. One leaves a country that over time no longer exists, and yet one rarely feels fully at home in their new culture. One is ever the perpetual foreigner. During this discussion, my brilliant student Alice asked a question that suggested the existence of a fourth space, which we developed and defined as an intentional interaction between two groups of people to create something new that belongs to both and to which both groups belong. Moments of discovery like this are the reason that I teach. Let's see the real-world applications of this fourth space. We have a fun expression in Italian, tutto fumo e niente arrosto, which means all smoke and no roast. Sometimes theory and classwork can be roast too, but the meat of the work, if you will, of building good neighbors happens beyond the classroom walls. In the case of the Introduction to Translation and Interpreting, a 300-level Spanish course cross-listed in Latino Studies and Education, the arrosto, the roast, is in the successful collaboration with our community partners. We are very lucky to have community partners who co-educate our students and allow them to collaborate with them with grace and insight, helping us to foresee and avoid potential pitfalls before they happen. Claire Roach with Notre Dame's ACE, that is the Alliance for Catholic Education program, and Holy Cross Elementary School's Spanish-English dual immersion programs, for example, communicates Holy Cross's beautiful vision and mission to our students and explain the students' roles in realizing that work. Claire does this with such passion and detail that students often describe her talks to our class as transformative, and indeed many choose to explore ACE fellowships as an option after graduation. During our 4-year partnership with Holy Cross, our students have translated parent handbooks, produced videos to explain what dual immersion education is, and what a day in the life of a Holy Cross dual immersion student looks like. We create age and culturally appropriate vocabulary teaching materials, and we have acted as simultaneous interpreters, and that's the class that Alec was in, simultaneous interpreters for parent workshops on financial literacy and on the building and supporting of literacy at school and at home. Holy Cross's wonderfully successful program has been gaining national recognition. So most recently, our students translated a full year's curriculum, including children's songs and poems, which was the tough part, but it was good, for implementation by schools for the Archdiocese in Chicago, and eventually by the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. All of this to say that our students know that their work is destined for real-world application, and that the quality of their work is a reflection of our partners. It has to be impeccable. On a side note, because of the pandemic, we were not able to enjoy the most fun and fulfilling part of our partnership with Holy Cross this past semester, getting to interact with the students. There's no substitute for the joy that making those relationships brings, especially when those relationships are with pint-sized, wide-eyed, curious, and energetic youngsters who are getting an educational experience that most of us only dreamed of. To complement our work with Holy Cross, we interacted with a second partner last semester, El Hogar del Sagrado Corazón de Jesús in Paine, Chile. Our students met over Zoom once a week to pray with and interview the verbal residents of a rehabilitation and habilitation residence for men with cognitive disabilities. Some were verbal, many were nonverbal. So we met with the verbal ones. This center is supported by the Catholic Verbo Encarnado. The Notre Dame students then put together a beautiful bilingual book, and I will, here we go, here's the cover of that book. A beautiful bilingual book outlining the Hogar's institutional history and mission, including the profiles of its staff and resources. The book has been an invaluable tool for this worthy organization. They have used it for the purposes of explaining what they do and whom they serve, for fundraising, and to allow residents to recognize and celebrate each other. Padre David has shared that these men spend hours looking at the images of each other in print. And I want you to see there's Padre David and his profile in both English and Spanish. And these are the marvelous students who worked on that. the students wrote, let's see, so the innovative use of technology and a different look at who may be part of our community, in this case, a Catholic organization on another continent, is a silver lining amid so much loss and disruption over the last year and a half. The students rose to the occasion, carrying almost double a typical load, and they undertook the work with grace and generosity, collecting and sending small gifts from campus, and performing and recording a song in the Basilica for the residents of the Hogar. And that's where this picture was taken. Incidentally, that work has led us to exploring the Hogar as a site for community-based and service learning for students who study abroad in Chile, in Santiago, Chile, and as a possible ISSLP, International Summer Service Learning Program site. This is gratifying, wonderful work. But what really gives me chills is seeing what the students do with it when they leave the dome. I could not be more lucky and more proud to introduce to you Alec Helmke, with whom I was lucky enough to have for both my culture, conversations, and writing course about Mexico, from the conquest to modern Mexico, and in my introduction to translation and interpreting course. He came to Notre Dame with his glorious sense of wonder and justice, and he found a home here, including his study abroad in Puebla, where it flourished. I'll give you a little introduction of Alec, and then I'm going to let him take it away. Alec grew up in the small town of Waunakee, Wisconsin, and started school at Notre Dame in 2015. While on campus, he was involved in a variety of research projects while studying for a degree in history and pre-health studies. Yet his greatest passion, as Alec will surely talk about soon, was community service. In particular, his experiences integrating in Latino communities abroad and around South Bend shaped his Notre Dame experience and inspired him to continue working toward a career in healthcare. Now, Alec is studying pharmacy at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where the lessons gained from Notre Dame experiential learning continue to motivate him towards his goal of making safe, high-quality medications accessible to marginalized communities. Alex, I'm going to pass the torch here.
Thank you so much to Prof. Elena and to all of you for offering me the chance to speak with you today. I'll begin with the story of when I found my fourth space. On New Year's Eve of 2019, I found myself in Honduras, volunteering with Nuestros Pequeños Hermanos, a children's home that serves kids coming from unstable family backgrounds. In the weeks before, I'd been anxious. This would be my first time away from home over the holidays. So how would I react to being away from my family during one of the most special seasons of the year? I wasn't from here. So what was I doing here among people who looked at me like a stranger? Early in the day, I made a new friend, a little 7-year-old girl who, no matter how fast we had to run or how long we spent searching for clues, held my hand for the entirety of the scavenger hunt. Later that night, as I sat near a crackling bonfire, I was surrounded by a group of some of the youngest boys in the home, and we laughed together right up until the fireworks were launched at midnight. Between the embers of the fire, the fireworks, and the smiles on the boys' faces, I really can't say which shone the brightest. But what I can say, without a doubt, was that in reflecting on this experience, I had found a fourth space. That is, I had created a meaningful connection not to a place, but to a community. In the eyes of the kids I shared the day with, I was not a stranger. My intentional interaction with them on that day and in the months prior had made all of us feel valued and loved as though we were actual siblings. So despite whatever anxiety I had to the contrary, I did spend the holidays with my family. Yet my transition from my first space to my fourth space was a journey that had been years in the making. I grew up in suburbia, a culturally and racially homogenous town just outside of Madison, Wisconsin. When I took Spanish in high school, my studies were limited to the aspects of the language I hated the most, struggling to conjugate irregular verbs, learning vocabulary about travel and cooking, and straining to understand the Shakira songs our teacher began each class with. Needless to say, when I enrolled at Notre Dame, I didn't plan to go much farther with Spanish. What was the point if I didn't enjoy the language and would never use it in real life? Enter Profe Elena in Spanish Conversation Writing, a course that would truly change my life. Sure, we continued to study grammar and vocabulary, but in this course, we also did something different. We used them, and we put our lessons in historical and cultural context I had never before been lucky enough to learn. I vividly remember watching the film Voces Inocentes, which discusses the child soldiers who fought during the Salvadoran Civil War. Watching this film in Spanish as I continued to learn the language was challenging, but what was even more difficult for me to understand was how I had failed to learn about this brutal conflict at any point in my early education. This wasn't Rome in 400 AD. This was the 1990s. And as Americans, the war took place in our own backyard. My passion to learn had been kindled like the sparks of that Honduran bonfire. And now, realizing for the first time the striking closeness of Latin American social issues, I was ready to learn more. That same semester, I took a leap, a jump off the deep end, as my parents might have called it. I applied and was accepted to study abroad in Puebla, Mexico. Suitcase and sunscreen in tow, I arrived in a new country anxious to put my now rusty Spanish to use. From the moment I stepped off the plane, I realized that, like the student profe mentioned earlier, my knowledge of Mexican culture was woefully inadequate. As I looked around at the towering buildings, the beautiful campuses, and the quaint, peaceful neighborhoods, I wondered, why had I never bothered to learn more about what Mexico was really like, beyond the beaches of Puerto Vallarta and the dusty border towns of old westerns? In Puebla, I went to lectures, of course, but I learned much, much more through experience. Some of my greatest lessons took place not on campus, but around the dining room table with my host mom, Olivia, who I think is in this next slide on the PowerPoint if we want to change here. Our travels throughout Mexico, from the urban sprawl of Mexico City to the dirt roads of Chiapas, allowed me to see the diversity of a country that only months earlier had been entirely foreign to me. In particular, I realized that my experiential learning was not merely a part of my education, it was a part of my life. When I was building friendships with Mexican students at our university, I developed a deeper understanding of their culture while simultaneously improving my language skills. When I shadowed physicians on rotations in Mexican hospitals, I learned of the unique healthcare challenges faced in Latin America and developed familiarity with the medications that are now second nature to me. And even when I danced to reggaeton music at local bars, I realized that rhythm and dance are as much a part of Latino youth culture as they are of our own. I was hooked, to say the least. My Spanish had progressed quickly, much faster than my dancing skills, I might add. So I wanted to continue learning more. And it wasn't long before my Notre Dame journey would take me somewhere new, to La Libertad, El Salvador, where I joined an interprofessional team of clinicians offering nutritional and health education to campesino families. At the same time, my site partner and I were blessed with the opportunity to explore El Salvador from the back seat of a red Jeep driven by Gene Palumbo, a journalist who had spent most of his life in the country. After Voces Inocentes piqued my interest in the Salvadoran Civil War, I now had the opportunity to learn from people who had lived through it. Figures and concepts universal to the Salvadoran people, Oscar Romero, Maras, liberation theology, inmigración, and pupusas became a part of my life. And before I knew it, the opportunity to work side by side with gifted Salvadorans to serve at-risk families made me recognize the poignancy of Gustavo Gutierrez's preferential option for the poor, a Catholic social teaching I now consider intrinsic to my identity. El Salvador taught me that accompaniment, that is, walking alongside those in difficult circumstances, is a transformative experience. In the smiles of mothers and children we worked with in small communities, and in the hopeful eyes of incarcerated men we met in Salvadoran prison, I formed a true connection to service and to the Latino culture. Now, experiential learning was not merely a part of my life. My experiences had informed my identity and shaped my vocation. During senior year, I brought my newfound appreciation for accompaniment back to the United States. Needless to say, I'd already begun to realize how experiential learning was transforming my life. So I overcame that great disease that afflicts all fourth-year college students, senioritis, to enroll in classes that would deepen my connection to marginalized communities. In the fall, I took part in Inside Out, where I studied alongside incarcerated men at the Westville Correctional Facility, a prison in northern Indiana. For a kid whose only experience with criminal justice was watching reruns of Law and Order with his parents, the course was absolutely eye-opening. Talking with the men helped me realize that broken, corrupt justice systems do not belong to Latin America, but are pervasive and affect our local communities just as powerfully. At the same time, I joined Profesora Maricel Moreno's course on race and ethnicity in US Latino literature. As issues of race became glaringly obvious within the walls of Westville Prison, they also revealed themselves on the pages of the novels we read in class. Experience reinforcing didactic learning, yet again. As luck, fate, or serendipity would have it, during my last semester, I was back in Profe Elena's classroom, taking her Introduction to Translation course. The kid who had walked into her freshman year Spanish class 4 years earlier had seen his life completely changed by experiential education. In her class, a passion for Latin American culture and history was born. While studying abroad, I came to recognize the diversity of the Mexican people and developed an appreciation for opportunities to learn that exist outside the classroom. In El Salvador and at Westville, my face-to-face interaction with marginalized communities and striking social injustices endowed me with a new mission to accompany those in need. And now, my experiential learning in Profe Elena's translation course informs my current pursuits. After teaching us about the vital importance of high-quality interpretation in her course, Profe Elena took us out into the community to Holy Cross Elementary School, where we learned that interpretation is not merely substituting one word for another, nor is interpretation a service that is offered to the community out of necessity. Interpretation is a dynamic partnership in which the interpreter strives to give voice to non-native speakers while also working to accompany the community they serve. Like the fourth space I mentioned earlier, interpretation is a process that belongs to both parties, an intentional interaction meant to create something essential, understanding. Now, after a year in Honduras, which I could talk about for hours, I'm back in the classroom studying pharmacy at the University of Minnesota. And if we want to change slides here too, I've got a couple more pictures of Honduras on this one. But despite stepping beyond the shadow of the Golden Dome, I'm still blessed to be involved in experiential learning. Aside from my studies, I work as an interpreter at a student-run free clinic serving mainly uninsured families on the south side of Minneapolis. As I began my time at this clinic, I was thrilled to be using my Spanish skills to connect with patients in my new home community. However, I was also discouraged at the lack of continuing education for the interpreter team and at the poor manner in which clinicians utilized interpreters in our clinic. As such, drawing on my years of experiential learning as inspiration, I signed on to help coordinate the interpreter team. And in only a few short weeks, we plan to launch a new educational initiative called SENA Sessions, in which interpreters and English-speaking volunteers will come together to learn about facilitating effective communication across linguistic barriers. Simply put, it is time to make our clinic a fourth space where diverse volunteers, clinicians, and cultures can engage in intentional, meaningful conversations with the goal of mutual understanding and higher quality patient care. With any luck, our SENA sessions will inspire others to pursue meaningful change in our clinic as we seek to make a preferential option for the poor and marginalized in our local community. I am truly blessed with a wonderful family, including my father, Mark Helmke, who's tuned into this session and was so touched by my own experience at Notre Dame that now he started his own journey and took a job with the Department of Development. I'm also blessed with educational opportunities that most people only dream of. And I'm blessed with the opportunity to speak with you today. Simply put, my experiential education at Notre Dame has transformed me from a disinterested suburban kid to an empowered, socially cognizant, and motivated young man, eager to accompany those in need and to promote meaningful change in our local and global communities. Thank you so much to Professora Elena Mangione Lora and to the Mexico City Global Center for this platform. And I deeply appreciate all of your time and attention. I also offer my sincerest gratitude to Lisette Monteroso and to all the staff at the Notre Dame Center for Social Concerns. I'll end with this quote, which was spoken by the great Salvadoran saint Oscar Romero just moments before he was martyred, and which continues to inspire me. Sabemos que todo esfuerzo para mejorar una sociedad, sobre todo cuando está tan metida esa injusticia, es un esfuerzo que Dios bendice, que Dios quiere, que Dios nos exige. We know that every effort to better our society, especially a society so stuck in this sin and injustice, is an effort that God blesses, that God wants, that God demands of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alec. Thank you, Elena, for sharing your experiences and your perspectives. It's really been a pleasure to hear them. I'm going to start the Q&A. I'm going to take the moderator's privilege and get us started, but I invite anyone else with questions or comments to speak up. We try to be relatively informal here, so if you want to submit it in the chat, or if you want to raise your virtual hand or simply type, I have a question, please feel free to do so. My question is a very, well, it started very practical in my mind. I was thinking about our current students in Puebla, our students planning to come in the spring semester, as well as those that might be thinking about applying in the future. And then I started thinking about, well, what about those doing ISSLP in Puebla, or there's a new ISSLP program in Tijuana, or perhaps studying in Chile or Peru or elsewhere. Of course, we also have Mexican students who either come for a semester or for all 4 years to Notre Dame. So my question is, what is your advice to them? This is to both of our panelists. What's your advice to those either preparing for or hoping to enter into, I suppose, initially a third space and create a fourth space? How can they prepare for that, either at Notre Dame or wherever they happen to be?
Alec, I would love to hear what you have to say about it. The premise we start with in preparing students from the classroom perspective is sort of going over what it is to be a good guest. So a good guest is in tune with his or her surroundings, is polite, and is open to whatever is being offered. And I think that, coupled with some of the theory that they get in terms of cultural competency, cultural appreciation, I think those things are a good start. But I think the biggest thing is that unlearning, thinking that we know anything about Mexico at all, or about the countries that we'll have an immersion experience in, because I had done some work before my first real trip to Puebla. I had done some work in Reynosa on the border as a translator and trainer, and in the capital. But the more I travel, the more I realize how much I don't know, and sort of understanding that can open you up to things. But Alec, I bet you have something much more interesting to say.
I don't know about more interesting, but I think it really goes back to this great conversation we've been having about experiential learning and about intercultural experiences being a partnership. If you're studying abroad, a meaningful experience is not just going to be given to you. And I mean, it's an absolute blessing, a privilege to be able to study abroad, but there's a lot of work to do too. And the experiences I had did not come just automatically. So I would say for those who are preparing to go abroad, whether that be for travel or for study abroad or whatever the purpose may be, do some work ahead of time to try to understand the culture you're going to be a part of. Simple things like listening to music, reading some literature, developing an understanding of some of those like surface level cultural aspects so that you can dive a little bit deeper once you get to your location. For example, for me, I found that music has been a lot of fun for me. And listening to Spanish music has helped me to get in the mindset to have a deeper understanding of the culture. It's given me something to talk about with people when I go down to Latin American countries. And even here in the United States, it was just this last weekend, I went to a Latin dance class in Minneapolis. So it's finding those little connections that help you to grow into a deeper understanding of the culture you're going to be a part of. And it's about putting in the effort of maybe feeling a little bit uncomfortable, maybe feeling like you don't belong for a while, but also recognizing that this is just a part of the process. That if you put in your effort, if you continue to try to understand the culture you're integrating in and continue to put yourself out there to get involved in new experiences, that you will start to develop deep connections and meaningful relationships with that culture.
Very well said and well put. So I see Fred Vogelweed here has congratulated you both on an excellent presentation and discussion, and noted how much it coincides with his experiences as spending part of his life in Mexico and part in the United States. I'm intrigued by, Elena, you and I have discussed this a little bit before, but I'm really intrigued by this idea of the spaces, right? The transnational identity and the creation of it. Having been fortunate enough myself on a few occasions, 3 occasions, to live outside of my home country for an extended period, and I suppose 4 if you count the years that I was in Indiana, it being quite different from the southern United States. I've also been struck by this idea that not that you lose your first space, but there's the old trope: you can't go home again, right? It continues to change, and of course, you have been changed by this experience, this cross-cultural experience. And so, I mean, what do we think of those that have? I mean, they're not in a third space, they're not in a second space, they haven't created a fourth space, but they're kind of a mix of spaces. And I admit, I'm not immersed in this literature of transcultural identities, but it seems to me that there's, I don't know, is there a 1.2? How do we think about this idea of, especially in the global society we are, of existing in so many different places at once, that they change us in this way?
I wish I had a good answer for you, Mike. I think the first step is having these conversations and being open to one another. The idea of whether there's a 1.2, sure. That's when you go back home and realize that home is no longer what it was, right? Sort of that third space of not belonging, I think, offers, it's a painful place to be. My own family is an immigrant family from Italy, and even though I grew up here in Indiana, a mile from campus, I grew up feeling like I never fit in. And but I think if one is able to see the gifts in that, you're able to offer another perspective. You find your own community, and you do work with incredible people like Alec. Those are the gifts out of all of that. So, and then if one is so inclined, I mean, there are so many applications to this. We are choosing to partner up with the Center for Social Concerns and do this work in the context of social justice and cultural understanding. But there are many, when I said this is a booming industry since the mid 90s, I meant it. There are assessments to measure intercultural competency and efforts going. Notre Dame, our Center for the Study of Languages and Cultures, is just got a huge grant to host an international conference in the spring on intercultural competence, because it is valuable in any discipline that we choose to apply it in, and it's valuable at home. I think something that you kind of alluded to in your question, I'm just going to sort of flesh it out a little bit, is that when we talk about, you talked about Indiana being a different culture from the South, and there are all kinds of, Stacy Johnson, who's a researcher in this at Vanderbilt University, talks about idiosyncratic culture. So we can talk about culture on a micro level, and we can look at culture and use these tools in all sorts of contexts, including the workplace, and including different pockets of our community. I don't know if I actually answered your question, Mike, but it was fun to talk about.
Well, thank you very much. No, I appreciate your reflections on that. And of course, the diversity that we see in the United States, we see here in Mexico as well, right? The idea of the microculture, or even a country this scale, as well as countries that are smaller, have a variety of, or a depth, a diversity of cultures that are so intriguing and fun to explore when you have the opportunity. I see we have a question from Kevin Gallagher. Kevin, you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hey, thank you. I really appreciated listening to you, Profe and Alec. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. I have a question about the unlearning process that you guys were talking about. I studied abroad in Puebla in the spring of 2020. And something that I heard a lot from people when they found out I was going to study there is like, why would you go there? In other words, why wouldn't you go somewhere quote unquote nice like Spain? And I heard that from even people in my family, friends, especially those studying abroad in places like London. And I think maybe one solution to this is engaging oneself and the people we care about around us with things like music, like you were talking about, Alec. But I was just wondering what your thoughts are on trying to push back against these types of almost automatic responses about Mexico and Central America, and particularly like the white American psyche.
Oh, I get chills listening to that question. And I think it's a wonderful question. I know Alec will have plenty to say on this. And I can only say that going back to the elephant can be eaten one bite at a time. I would say start with the things that fascinate you about the country. And so, there are plenty of things that we know about Spain, the art, the flamenco, I mean, the food, these kinds of things that we for whatever reason, and it's always very curious. I think I mentioned earlier, maybe I was talking to Alec about this earlier. My parents spent a semester in Puebla. My mom used to teach Italian and taught for a semester there. And she said that in talking to students there in Puebla, one of the young women was shaking with anger. And she said, I'm so angry that they never they never showed us these things about Mexico. We didn't know anything about it. And there's just so many interesting things. We're talking about the voladores de Papantla, these incredible feats of acrobatics and music and worship and so on, that just seem otherworldly, but they're unknown to us here in the States. So Kevin, I would say starting with things that you know, things that piqued your interest. And I bet if you show people, look at this incredible music, look at the flowers, the colors, the artisan work, the diversity, the landscape, people can't help but fall in love, if not with the place, with your enthusiasm. And that's a good starting point. And that helps them to unlearn. I think the worst thing that we can do as educators, and in your question, Kevin, it sounds you are an educator in that role. The worst thing we can do is be defensive. We can certainly sort of defend when it's appropriate, but I mean, not to attack or be judgmental of people's questions. But when they're asking you a question, that's an invitation to be taught. And so use what is dearest to you to teach them. That would be my advice. Alec, what would you say?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question, Kevin. And as someone who went to Puebla, I went through the same experience you're describing. And then also as someone who afterwards decided to go to El Salvador and then Honduras, I would say I went through those experiences twice more, where people came up to me and would ask, why on earth are you going to El Salvador or Honduras? Like, why don't you go to Cancun or Puerto Vallarta or somewhere where you can enjoy the beach and enjoy kind of that stereotypical view of Mexico? And I think Prof. Elena pretty much stole most of the words right out of my mouth. It's this idea of recognizing the concerns that your peers are bringing up, responding to the fact that yes, there are serious issues in many of these countries, just as there are in the United States. Responding to the fact that yes, there's poverty, there's violence, there's corruption, but also recognizing that that really exists in each country. And then really trying to center the conversation about your personal experiences. Until people really travel to the country themselves and have that immersive experience, they're not going to understand what you went through. But you can at least take a start by showing them pictures, by explaining stories of the moments that made you happy in Mexico, about the different stereotypes that were overturned when you got there. I know that when I returned from Mexico and I was showing my family pictures of like Mexico City, they were wondering, oh my gosh, that's Mexico City? That is not what I expected at all. Look at those beautiful museums, those towering skyscrapers, all the different cultural and religious sites all around the city. And I think just being willing to share your experiences is a great first step. And then if my dad's still on the call, it's been fun for me to actually have the great opportunity to take people important to me down to these countries. So if you have that opportunity to share not only through your storytelling, but also in real life by actually encouraging your loved ones to come with you on a trip to a place that's so important in your life, it makes a huge impact. I remember I was lucky enough to have my family there in Mexico and in Honduras, and they said they absolutely loved the experience, and it really got me the opportunity to overturn those stereotypes right there in front of them by allowing them to meet my friends and to see what my life was all about in these different countries. So again, just like being passionate about your experiences, being willing to share, recognizing the issues that occur in these societies, but also recognizing that people just want to learn, like Prof. Elena mentioned, and as kind of an ambassador to like the white community, to the people who are important to you. I think we have an important role to fill, and I think by being willing to share, you have a fantastic opportunity.
Thank you both. excellent answers. I'm going to echo Kevin and Alicia and all of those in the chat who have praised this presentation and mentioned how much they've enjoyed it. We're coming up on an hour now. I would highlight, I think Alicia sent her email there. She's the director of the Moreau College Initiative at Westville Correctional Facility, which is a phenomenal program. She would love to engage with the two of you. I'll make sure to save it so you can connect afterwards. But you know, I can't say much other than thank you. It's been wonderful to hear about your experiences and your perspectives on this topic. It's obviously something that I think most on this call have experience, right? I mean, we're a very fortunate group that many of us have a foot in at least 2, if not 3 or 4 different cultures and have had the experience. And so hearing this really resonates. Thank you also to all who joined us today. We'll be having the 3rd session of the semester in November 10th, which will look at access to healthcare in Chiapas, which will be an interesting topic as well. So with that, thank you all. Look forward to seeing you again and hope you have a great day.